Hi, this is Kathy from Gadget Stop 321, and in today's video, I'm going to be taking a look at Robert Oster African Gold. I'll do a writing sample with African Gold on 52 GSM Tomo River paper using a variety of pens and nib sizes ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a 1.5 stub nib. I'll take a look at writing samples that I did earlier on other types of paper. I'll compare Robert Oster African Gold to other gold inks from my collection. And finally, I'll take a look at the results of my water resistance test and the chromatography of this ink. Robert Oster African Gold came off the nib nice and uniformly, but as I was writing, it felt like the line that it was putting down was pretty thin. But now that I'm looking at it, I think as it dried, it maybe spread a little bit because it looks more comparable to the other writing samples that I've done with other inks. The swatch that I made with tweezers is nice and crisp on this Tomo River paper, but on some of the other papers, it had a little trouble grabbing and holding on. I don't see any sheen on the drip at the end of the swatch, but there is an attractive halo of darker ink, and you can see on the swatch the range in color or the range in darkness from the beginning of the swatch to the end it's attractive and indicates the kind of shading that you will see in the writing. I'm going to begin with my Pilot Kakuno. It has an extra fine stainless steel nib. It felt like it was going to be a little bit dry in this extra fine nib, but you can see it's putting down a decent amount of ink. I think part of the problem with this light golden brown, it's not super light, but it just doesn't pop like a blue would do, a darker blue. So it didn't feel unpleasant, but overall, this type of ink is not my favorite to use in an extra fine nib, just because of the lightness of the color of it. Next, I've got a Kaweco Lilliput. It has a fine stainless steel nib. As I was writing with this one, and I've noticed this on the other papers that I did writing samples on, this Kaweco Fine felt a little bit drier than the Pilot Extra Fine, and it was just a little bit drier. But I think it didn't feel unpleasant, and I should go back and say the Extra Fine Kakuno didn't really feel unpleasant. It's just the color of the ink that's being put down. I think my eyes are wanting to see more ink. I'm wanting to see more of this darker shade here. And maybe if I were writing with a wetter nib, a nib that was even wetter than this, maybe, because you can see the more ink you put down, it's a bit darker. I did like the Kakuno, the look of the line put down by the Kakuno more than the Lilliput, but and you can see the eyeballs look brown. If I were getting that shade, I would enjoy this a little bit more. I'm going to put a sad face on this one just to, I mean, I can obviously tell when I look at it. If I refer back to this, I would say, this isn't an ink I want to use in a finer nib. Next, I've got a Sailor 1911. It has a 14 karat medium nib. This is smooth, but kind of chalky. You know, you have that a little bit of feedback, but in a smooth kind of way, and I enjoy this. That, to me, that just looks so good. That now we're getting the proper amount of ink to really make this an enjoyable experience. And even though I would characterize this as a shading type ink, this Sailor nib and platinum medium nibs, I kind of put them in the same category. They tend to spread the ink out more evenly, but if you look at the line that's being put down really closely, you can see that halo of darker around the edges of each of the letters. I really like that look. That's what I like in my shading inks. Next, I've got a Pilot Metropolitan. It has a stainless steel stub nib. This Pilot CM or stub nib is known to be a little bit dry. Now, when an ink is really well saturated, that's okay. But for an ink that's kind of lighter, in the lighter bits here, I'm just not as fond of it. And like I said, I prefer when a little bit more ink is being put down and we're getting these darker shades. And so this is just a personal preference. I'm not as fond of this one. Nothing wrong with how it felt or anything. And I think part of the issue here is, like I mentioned, when you're writing with this ink, with like the dip nib and whatever, it put down a line that was kind of thin, and I noticed this with the stub nibs. When you've got the thinner lines here, they're really thin with this ink. So, just not my favorite. Next, I've got a Penlux Masterpiece Grande. It has a stainless steel broad nib. That's really nice. I'm happy that this looks so good, and I'll talk about this in a minute. I was looking for an ink that would perform well in this pen and look good, and I'm thinking this might be the one. And finally, I've got a Pen BBS cartridge converter pen. I've replaced the stock nib with a 1.5 stainless steel stub nib. The horizontal lines are really thin, but this nib is putting down a good amount of ink, so the vertical lines are nice and wet, and it looks really good. It felt glassy smooth on this smooth paper, but it was still pleasant. Okay, while this dries, I'll take a look at some writing samples that I did on other paper. On this Rhodia paper, all the pens performed really well, but some of them, just like on the Tomo River paper, just were not my favorite. The extra fine and fine nibs, to me, felt nice enough on this paper, but the legibility of this color of ink just isn't my favorite. But once we get up to the Sailor medium nib, it's really nice, and it felt really nice writing with it on the paper. The Pilot Metropolitan was nice and smooth, but kind of like on the Tomo River paper, it just wasn't my favorite. The horizontal lines were just really thin, and that kind of impacted the legibility of it, but it was really smooth on this paper. The Penlux Masterpiece Grande it felt velvety smooth, just like the stub nib. The stub nib on the Tomo River paper felt glassy smooth, but on this Rhodia paper, it felt kind of velvety, so I really liked both of these. And my Masterpiece Grande is a nice reverse writer, and it felt and looked really nice on this paper. It wrote a little bit more broad than the Lilliput fine nib. I was expecting that Lilliput fine nib to write more like this, more like the reverse writing on my Penlux, but I'm kind of curious now how a medium fine would look, like where the cutoff point is for the legibility to be good. On my tweezers swatch, it grabbed the paper pretty good here at the beginning, but it had trouble holding on toward the end. I have a feeling maybe that's because it pulled quite a bit of the ink out here at the beginning and it was just running lower on ink. The glass dip nib, again, was even more uniform than on the Tomo River. Very uniform and kind of, I guess this looks a little bit thinner. Maybe on the Tomo River paper it didn't affect it as much, but on this paper it looks a bit thinner than normal. But it was very pleasant to write with. Now, copy paper, I say this every time, is not my favorite to write with a fountain pen, but sometimes some fountain pens perform acceptably. My Penlux and, yeah, really my Penlux and the stub nib, the 1.5 stub nib, were pleasant enough to write with, but they just don't look that great. The ink looks really flat on this paper, and it tended to spread a little bit. It doesn't look very crisp, and let me see. The Sailor wasn't too bad, but again, it didn't feel bad to write with. It just doesn't look great. One thing I do need to point out, on the Metropolitan, it had trouble grabbing the paper. You can kind of see that first vertical stroke had trouble grabbing the paper. Okay, in my Leuchtturm notebook, I left a little space here to go back and put my Pilot Blue writing sample, but I had a little trouble here at the beginning with my stub nib grabbing the paper, but once it did grab it, it looks really good. The shading, the halo on each of the letters looks really good, and that's because it was putting down a nice amount of ink. You can see the horizontal lines are pretty thin, but the vertical lines just look so good. As I was doing these writing samples, I was eager to compare African Gold to a couple different inks from my collection. Number one, Noodler's Golden Brown. Now here's the problem here. When I did my writing test with Noodler's Golden Brown, I loved it. I think I made the comment, it's more golden than it is brown, but I loved it. It had a brown water-resistant component that I loved that about it. But since then, I've seen other people who loved this version of the Golden Brown go buy bottles of it, and that Golden Brown is more brown than golden. So the inconsistency of Noodler's Golden Brown has kind of prevented me from buying a bottle of it. I did buy a bottle of KWZ Honey. Now, it doesn't have the water-resistant component, but it is a very attractive ink. It has a little more brown in it than the African Gold. I think I like African Gold better. I like that it's more gold, but it's still legible in the kind of nibs that I want to use it in. Now, Robert Oster Cafe Crema doesn't have much of the gold. It's more brown, but it's also an attractive ink. And Robert Oster Aussie Liquid Gold is yellow. So don't let the gold in the name fool you. It's not a golden color. It's got gold sheen or gold shimmer, but it's more of a yellow ink. I was hoping that Robert Oster African Gold would have a water-resistant component, kind of like Noodler's Golden Brown, but it is a disappearing ink when you get it in water. I did a writing sample with all my pens on this little piece of rhodia paper, and after it dried, I submerged it in water for 10 minutes, and it just completely lifted off the paper. And I had kind of anticipated a lack of water resistance when I did my chromatography. You can see it all just goes up the page. I found it really interesting that this gold color ink with some minty green turns into a golden brown. That's fascinating to me. Okay, my writing sample on Tomo River paper, as I'm looking at it, I like the look of the Pilot Metropolitan, that stub nib. I like the shading that I get. It wasn't fun to write with. My two favorites are the Sailor Medium and the Penlux Broad. I feel like medium and broad nibs, and I'm going to preface this, both of these nibs have a little bit of feedback. The Sailor had a little bit more feedback. The Penlux has just a hint of feedback. I feel like those are the kind of nibs that are going to perform best with this type of ink. And I'm looking forward to trying this ink in my Penlux. And I'm glad that I got this sample from Van Ness. They make nice big samples, 4 milliliter samples, so I might get 1 or 2 good fills out of this sample, and I'm looking forward to doing that. All right, if you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.